trying to go live now, see if it works. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. Very excited to have our guest speaker today, Sarah Dunifon. So we'll get going shortly. I'm just gonna give people, maybe a minute to settle in, and then we will get going. But again, welcome. So just hang tight and we'll get started in a couple of seconds. Okay, there's enough time there. So welcome again. My name is Fanuel Muindi. I am the founder and chief president of SAI, the STEM Advocacy Institute. And we work to enable and accelerate the building of tools and programs that connect science and society. We're looking to increase accessibility, diversity, inclusivity, all those programs, research. And so we have our residents, we have fellows. Fellows program is our flagship program, intern as well, and they're all working towards this goal of increasing this accessibility in STEM and connecting science and society. And so what better way to get started with 2021 by talking about a topic that is very, very dear to me, talking about evaluation. And it's something that in the SAI Fellows program, we talk extensively to our fellows and on how important it is to make sure that your evaluation is critical. It's critically set up so that you can be set up for success. And so I'm really excited to have Sarah today join us. And she's a founder and principal evaluator of Improved Insights. And she and I got connected over the break. I got an email from her and she was saying, hey, my name is Sarah. I'm interested in what you guys are doing. Can we talk? And I said, yes, absolutely. Let's absolutely talk very quickly. And in that conversation, I knew that I needed to ask her to at least come to one of our sessions. And I was super excited when she was available for this day. So Sarah, thank you so much. Joining us today as well is Claire, who will also jump in and ask a few questions here and there. So you might see her here and there. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sarah and get going. And so Sarah has a couple slides where she'll present, and then we'll get into a conversation for the remainder of the time. And this is a free-flowing conversation, so please feel free to jump in for those who are here with us on Zoom. So Sarah, welcome and take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. So I am Sarah Donovan. I'm principal and founder of Improved Insights, which is an evaluation consulting firm that focuses on nonprofits, institutions, museums, higher education, K-12 education, basically anyone who's doing informal learning. And so my background is actually in informal STEM learning, research and evaluation, and STEM equity. And you might say, what is informal learning? Well, informal learning is any learning that takes place outside of a formal classroom context. Some people define this as lifelong learning. Sometimes you hear it as out of school time learning, but it's anything that's not in the regular school time environment. So I've worked throughout my career in this informal STEM learning and STEM equity, both within museums and cultural institutions and in higher education. And the through line for me has really been this idea of research, evaluation, and assessment as a core component of this work that we're doing for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. But that's really my niche, my interest, my passion, and my career is understanding the impacts that our informal learning or STEM learning is having on our participants, and understanding how to best amplify those impacts to the people that matter. And so I will dive into my slides here, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A as well. So give me one moment. Okay, so my chat today is going to be all about evaluation. So we're going to talk about what evaluation is, why you might need it, how to find an evaluator, what you might assess or evaluate. And I'm looking forward again to any questions or discussion that we have so I can dive into your unique needs, as we know evaluation is going to be different for every single party that comes to the table. So why might we evaluate? We might evaluate our programs for a number of reasons, starting with accountability. And I would add transparency onto this as well. So evaluation offers us this really great opportunity to look at our programming and look at, are we doing what we said we would do? Are we following the model that we set out to follow? And how are we maintaining accountability and transparency to those who have invested in us? And this can be financially or otherwise. It can be also to our participants. We might also evaluate for program improvement. So you might actually look at the work that your program is doing and evaluate so that you understand what's working, what's not working, what you need to tweak or change, what's going well. And you might evaluate to demonstrate your impacts. And this could be to stakeholders, to your participants, to the funders. Oftentimes, evaluation is a core component of a grant that you've received. So you're asked to evaluate to back up that grant. And it can also make a case for why folks should invest in your programming to begin with. I think when you're doing the type of work that we're all doing, it's very easy to say, I know this program works because I see it firsthand. I can see anecdotally that the students that come out of my program are more confident, or they've gained STEM skills, or they are more interested in STEM concepts. Evaluation offers you a very tangible way to measure and then communicate those impacts so that you're not only speaking on anecdote, but you're able to more easily convince people of the power that your work has. So what might you evaluate? There are so many different things that you can evaluate, and it really depends on your needs and your interests. So typically with an evaluation project, we would start with an evaluation plan that outlines what your questions are that you need answers to. And those questions might align with the funding requirements from a grant maker. It might align with areas of research or areas of interest that you want to better understand what's happening in the program or the impacts of that program. But you really kind of define up front, what are we going to be looking into and why? That can be a whole bevy of things. That can be starting from the bottom, monitoring elements, KPIs. So you might look at the number of participants in your program, the number of tweets or retweets. You might look at scholarship money administered. You might even look at satisfaction levels. So when folks come out of the program, did they have a good time? The next level up, I would say, is more focused on learning gains. So if you are trying to get students to better understand, let's say, a concept in biology, did they actually retain that information? Do they actually understand it after taking part in the program? You can look at content knowledge gain, you can look at skill gain, you can look at a whole bunch of things there. I think the most challenging and niche that you can get with evaluation is looking at more of these psychosocial outcomes. So things like attitudes, values, behavior, things that are a little bit more challenging to measure, but tell you a little bit more about what potential impacts or outcomes or effects your program might have had on the participants. And you can also look at these in terms of short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. So if you're familiar with the logic model, you might have created one of these, you might have defined short-term and long-term outcomes already. Short-term outcomes are typically measured after the completion of a program or a course. Longer term outcomes are typically measured maybe several months or years after completing a program or a course. And as you might imagine, long-term outcomes are a little bit more challenging to measure, but can speak to deeper impact on your participants if done in the right way. Let's say you have your STEM program running, you've decided, yes, I do want to evaluate this, either because you see the value and the need for evaluation, or because it's being required from a funder. You might say, okay, how do I incorporate this? You can certainly do some of this work in-house. There's all sorts of materials online about how to build valid satisfaction surveys, for example, or if you really want to get into the research, vetting different measures and different scales that have been validated in the literature, you can absolutely source that yourself. But if you're looking for something a little bit more robust, and if this is a bit out of your wheelhouse, you could consider also hiring an evaluator to do this work. And so there's 4 different kind of main areas that you can look for an evaluator. Those are outlined at the bottom. There's independent evaluators, who are just sole practitioners who do this work on their own. There's evaluation firms, which usually have a lot of different evaluators with different kind of areas of expertise operating within them. There are evaluation teams that are affiliated with universities. And there are internal evaluators who are internal to organizations. Typically, when you're looking at, let's say, the nonprofits or museums and cultural institution space, if you get to be of a certain size, you have the resources to have your own internal evaluation team. That's actually what I did earlier on in my career. And then I personally transitioned to this more independent or evaluation firm type model. There's pros and cons with all of them. And I would say what's more important than actually looking at where they're coming from is looking at what they do. So if we look up at the top there, a couple things that you're definitely going to want to consider when sourcing an evaluator is content expertise in your area. If you're focused on STEM communication, for example, or science communication, you can absolutely find people who that's their expertise and their focus. If you're looking at conservation education, it's my focus in part, you can find people who do just that. You also want to look at practical experience. So are these people who have actually conducted evaluation? They've gone beyond the classroom, they've worked with clients, they've done this work before, they know what the process looks like. You want to understand their approach, and that's both in terms of methods of evaluation. There are all sorts of methods that you can use in evaluation. A couple examples would be participatory, which is a style of evaluation that includes the client in most parts of the evaluation process. So rather than having an expert come in and tell you what you need to do in your program or how the evaluation is going to run, they will create the evaluation plan and process with you to ensure that it's relevant to your institution or your organization. Another method to know of is a culturally responsive. And that's a method that really tries to think critically about the populations that we're engaging as our audience, as our participants, and how the values and the identity that these folks bring into this process actually affects what we need to do in order to serve them best. So an example of that might be if you have a class of students that you're teaching, and of the 35 students, there are 2 who are non-English speaking. If you were not using a culturally responsive approach, you might say, it's okay, 33 students is a good response rate. Like, I don't really need to worry that much about those 2 other students. If you were using a culturally responsive lens, you would say, no, I'm going to translate these resources and make sure we hear from all of the students that are in this class. That's an important part of this. You will also want to consider communication style. So how are they going to work with you? Are you going to have periodic meetings where you're working on these materials together? You're making sure the instruments they're developing are appropriate. You get to see them before they're enacted, or is it mostly hands-off approach? And personability. So can you work with this person? Some evaluation engagements are long. They can be year-long. They can be multiple years. Is this somebody that you think that you can work with long-term, that you can give feedback to frankly, that will meet your needs. And then how would you actually then go about employing an evaluator? Well, there's a couple ways. You can send out an RFP or a request for proposals and outline what your project is, what you're looking for, maybe even how much you have to spend, the time frame. There are plenty of places online you can post that. You can also have one-on-one conversations with potential evaluators that you find online that you think might be a good fit, and ask them many of the same questions. What would be your approach? How do you tend to communicate with your clients? What would you propose that we employ for a project like this? And you can also ask around. Word of mouth is great. If you have folks that you trust who have used evaluators before, who are in your space, ask them who they recommend, who have they had a good experience with. Now, once you've kind of vetted that, you'll also want to consider how to sustain the evaluation, how to make it happen. So I definitely recommend writing it into your grants. More and more we are seeing that evaluation is a core component of grants, and it's an expectation. You will see different levels of grant funding requirement for evaluation depending on where you're looking. But a typical rule of thumb is about 10% of the funding that you're requesting should be allocated for evaluation upfront. And it can cost more than that depending on the study type. If you're doing an experimental study type, for example, it's going to cost substantially more than if you're doing, let's say, a summative program evaluation. Now, where do you actually find these evaluators? There's a couple of resources that I wanted to point you towards. So one of them is the website of the American Evaluation Association. And I would say this is the main accrediting institution for the US at least. There are accrediting organizations all over the world. Look for the one that's most relevant to you. But I'm going to show you on AEA how this operates so you can get a sense. They have all sorts of materials here. So if you'd like to learn more about evaluation, you can learn about the principles that they operate under. You can find resources and webinars and coffee chats and all sorts of things. You can also go to this Find an Evaluator tab to look for somebody who might be a good fit for your needs. And so you can do that by looking locally. If you want somebody who's nearby that you can meet with in person post-pandemic. You can also search for keywords about the type of work that you're doing. So if you're in science communication, you can actually search. Let's do it now. Science communication. Nobody, unfortunately, but let's just do STEM real broadly. I'm sure we'll find a ton. Yep, there's a ton of people. So then you can go through and learn more about these people, the type of work they typically do. You can search by name or by firm if you know that much. This is just a really great resource for that first step of sourcing. Another good resource is the CASE or Informal Science website. If you're working on STEM programming that's outside of that formal classroom context, this is a wonderful website to know. It's NSF funded, National Science Foundation. There's all sorts of resources here about evaluation, about informal science. There's publicly posted evaluation reports, so you can get a sense for what that might look like as a deliverable from your consultant. And here too, you can actually search for an evaluator. And here you can look at science communication. You can look at interest, you can look at expertise. So if we're looking at evaluation alone, you can look by country. So let's say we're looking in Australia, and we've got some folks right there who might be good fits that we can reach out to and ask about their services. So those are two really great resources to know. And that is the bulk of my formal presentation here. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. My information was there, or you can follow up with the SAI folks. And yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that sort of introduction and the setup to our discussion broadly about evaluation. I think, in fact, I didn't know about the broader search like engine for Evaluator Association in particular. So hopefully people will go and check that out. Yeah, so I wanted to, and at the beginning, you started talking about this, right? Like why evaluate, right? It's a very good question. Like, why should we evaluate? And so, I was wondering if we can go into more depth there. Now the field, as you said, more grants are requiring this as a component, right? Why are we evaluating these things? Why should we be thinking about this from the get-go, right? Like when you're building a program, it should be the thing that you actually comes up first. What is it that you want to see change, right? But let's go into that why a little bit from your end. At least what motivates, what do you think is a prime drive, should we say?
Yeah. So I think that's a great point. I really view it as thinking with the end in mind. If you're doing the type of work that we're doing, you're doing it because you want to create change in the world. And you think that you know how, right? You think that you've got these tactics or these program elements to employ that will bring about that change. And the purpose of evaluation is these things like accountability and transparency and appeasing funders, but it's also making sure that the work that we're doing is actually achieving what we hope it's doing. If you never evaluate and you've got these grand goals, you might think that you're reaching them, but you might not be. You really don't know. And there's a gap there between your expectation or what you think you're doing and what's actually happening. What evaluation can do is close that gap. It can tell you, here is the actual impact that your program's having. If you are reaching your goals, fabulous. This is a model that people need to know about, and they will trust you more because you've evaluated, because you've assessed it. And you can say, these are the key elements that make this program run and make it successful. If you see that there is a gap there, we're actually not meeting what we thought we were, this gives you a chance to revise, to edit your practice, to figure out what's working, what's not, make those changes, because ultimately we're here for the change. We're here to bring about positive, good, effects on the world. And we need to know if we're doing that or not, and then how to, get there if we aren't.
Yeah. And Claire, please feel free to jump in at any point. But yeah, I think to me that goes into this logic model that you briefly mentioned, right? And as most SAI folk know, logic model is, I live by them, and always a key thing that I always ask people, so what is the logic model, right? So you state the problem, and that usually I found to be actually a big challenge is, what problem is it that you seek to tackle, right? And then what is the change that you seek to create, right, from that? So if we look at logic models, what is your typical advice for people as they are beginning those phases, right? Creating this logic model, because I think a big challenge gets into the difference between impact and output, right? Because people get confused very frequently there. So if you can speak a little bit more to that difference, first of all, and then the logic model above it.
Sure, yeah. So the way that I approach logic models is I almost divide them into 3 sections. So if you look at the beginning of the logic model, typically on the left, you would have inputs and you would have activities. And so I always describe inputs as the things that you put into the program to make it run. This can be funding, this can be staff, this can be resources, space, etc. The activities then, of course, are the things that you're actually doing in the program. And so those are kind of one section. The second section, as I divide it in my mind, is the outputs, which I kind of create a proxy for monitoring with. So outputs can be really tangible numbers that you're already tracking, most likely. It's the number of followers you have, number of participants in a program, the number of scholarship money administered, etc. And then when you get to that third section, which is more of these outcomes, which can be short-term, long-term, or impacts, that's where we get a little bit more kind of esoteric, theoretical, up in the air with them. Impacts, usually on the far right, I would say, are the greater change that you wish to bring about through this program. So this could be community-wide, it could be within a space, let's say within STEM as a whole. This is something that you likely won't be able to measure against very quickly to see if you're having impact on that. It's something that is like the greater drive that you have for doing this work. So an impact that would fit that might be to create a more equitable space for STEM practitioners, right? That's really kind of this overarching lofty concept. The outcomes then, be they short-term or long-term, are related to those impacts, and they are a little bit more measurable in relation to your program. So it might be something that you're doing within the program that you can say after somebody participates, or maybe a year or two after they participate, they might be thinking or feeling or doing these things. And that's how we know that we are on our way to those impacts.
Yeah, so definitely like a spectrum that you get going, short term, long term. But I see a lot of that confusion sometimes where people are like, okay, what metric should I be using, right? For this one in particular here. So I think those are good. So I want to make sure everybody else, please jump in, actually, not just Claire. If you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask away. Claire?
Hi. Oh, go for it.
All right. Go ahead, Lillian.
I have a question. So during the process of evaluation, how do you center equity in there? Like, how do you make sure you're doing an evaluation that is not creating inequities?
That's a fabulous question. I think core in that is being familiar with some of the techniques of culturally responsive evaluation. It's also understanding that as an evaluator, either if you're an evaluation practitioner solely or somebody doing evaluation, you are bringing in your own values, your own lived experience, your own view of the world, and your own biases into the process. So it's understanding how those might influence the evaluation negatively, positively, and trying to identify and respond to those things as best that you can. And so sometimes that's making sure that multiple people are involved in a process, making sure that the audience that you're actually serving is involved in the process, to make sure, you're framing things in a way that makes sense to them. You're using the right language, making sure things are translated for everybody so no one is left out. There's a lot of techniques and approaches that you can use. There's a lot of great resources on culturally responsive evaluation on the AEA website, for example, but it's really kind of humbling yourself and recognizing that you need to put in extra work to make sure that you're responding in the best way that you can, knowing that we come in with these particular elements of ourselves influencing or informing the evaluation.
Yeah.
Claire?
That was a fantastic question. And kind of bouncing off that in a way, but I know a lot of times when you think about evaluating a specific project, there's that perception that the evaluation will take just as much work, if not more, compared to your actual project itself. And so I was just wondering, is there a way that we can kind of lessen that perceived burden that evaluation brings about?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that the first thing is recognizing how necessary evaluation is and how much value it's actually providing you as a practitioner. So rather than seeing it as an add-on that's going to take away from your core programming and that's just this thing I have to do to satisfy the funder, think about what it offers you. It offers you a chance to hear authentically from your participants, to understand really what's happening in your programming, to understand what impacts or effects the programming is having beyond just the ones you see on a day-to-day basis. Opportunity to improve the practice, to tell more people about the great work you're doing. There's so many great things about evaluation. So I think first and foremost, focus on those. And then, of course, there are ways to streamline the process once you get into it. I think folks see it as this lofty thing, sometimes a negative thing where they're going to be critiqued or told they're doing something wrong. And, we're always learning, we're always building. If you can kind of see it as a tool in your toolkit to improve your practice and just make your program go from like great to incredible, that's the way you got to frame it in your mind.
Thank you.
Good question.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I guess I'm curious about the process of becoming an evaluator and how you might go about getting your, what types of things would you need to do to become an independent evaluator, and just the process of getting your first client, say, as someone who's new?
Sure, yeah. So right now, there's no really common set of accreditation for evaluation, at least in the US. It's a relatively new space, and there are various ways that folks find their way into it. So there are wonderful training programs, universities, Claremont McKenna is one example that does evaluation education, and a lot of folks choose to go kind of that formal education route. There's also a lot of folks that do evaluation for their job. They do kind of continuing education through some of these societies that exist, like AEA. There are folks that kind of do a mixture of the two. There's a lot of training and resources and academic journals and all sorts of things that you can reference to kind of understand some of the theory behind it and some of the research-based approaches to it. I would say the most important thing is just getting started doing it, because evaluation is both all of these kind of concepts and things that you learn and understand, survey design, the different approaches to evaluation and theory behind them, but it's also a process. And it's also understanding how to work with clients and how to help them define and understand, their needs, their intended outcomes. It's a both and. In terms of how to get started in it, I would say just either find an organization that's doing evaluation and see if you can get involved with them. You can look into higher education for it. I got my start just as a part of the role that I was doing in informal science learning, being the person to do the evaluation on team. And then I grew from there and really started to specialize in it and pick up more knowledge. And in terms of finding clients, I think once you kind of gone through that process and established yourself, or maybe aligned with yourself with one of these evaluation firms, you're really looking for folks that have that need and need help really defining where they want to go with the evaluation. I find that a lot of new clients to evaluation don't actually even know what they don't know yet. And so it's a lot of guiding them through, maybe you do want to create a logic model, maybe you do need to think about what are your intended impacts or outcomes for this program, and how do those align to an evaluation plan that we might create, or key evaluation questions.
Yeah, and I think the logic model, I would say, you can never go wrong by starting there. It can be very basic, like the most basic version, and just iterate over time. All right, so this is the first thing we do with our fellows is almost like first week or two, it's about the logic model. And it's amazing how sometimes many of the programs start collapsing there, where you're like, okay, let's draw these logical connections between the inputs, right? And the activities and the outputs and the metrics that you're using to measure different impacts. I think that's really key, that kind of my message to make people create a logic model to get started. So it's not the case that most programs or most individuals are going to be able to hire an evaluator, right? In fact, most of them do not have that capacity, right? So I think I want to transition to talking about people who are just starting programs, initiatives. Maybe they have a website, they have Twitter, they're doing some SciComm or SciEngage, all these things. Logic models, of course, are a really good proxy for that to get started, right? But from your practice, what have you seen as some of the common challenges, should we say, or mistakes people do? Of course, not evaluating is one, obviously, but what are some other traps along the way that what people do, and how can we avoid them?
Yeah, I think certainly not evaluating is a great one to start with. I think do anything that you can to get started in evaluation, even if you're just tracking participation numbers. Collect as much data as you can, just have it on hand. You might need it for the future. Just make sure that you're starting to think about those things and collect. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see is folks who just start evaluating something without thinking about what they're evaluating and what it might be used for. So certainly when you think about those KPIs or those monitoring metrics like number of participants, those are always going to be necessary. I do see a lot of people jump into evaluating like satisfaction as kind of a first level steps. So did people enjoy the program? Would they recommend the program? And that's fine, kind of depending on your needs. But I think a more strategic way to approach it would be to revert back to that logic model, revert back to any materials you've developed that really outline the program model and what you're trying to do with this program, and think critically about what measures could you employ to see if you're actually doing those things, because that's the core of what you need to be doing. So I think that a mistake I see is when that's not aligned, when people are evaluating things that they haven't articulated as key outcomes, impacts, outputs, things that they want to be seeing in the program, but then they're measuring something completely different.
Yeah, and something early that I tell our fellows as well is talk to the people, right? Even earlier on, even one or two, just get some conversations going, and figure out what are challenges they're having, and then what are some things that you could measure, and something that they also, back to your point, participatory, right? Engage them earlier on.
Yep.
That's part of that process. Other questions? Well, I'll keep asking them away.
I had a quick question.
Go ahead.
And I was kind of curious about survey development. So I know that on your own, you kind of put together some surveys and try to do that as an evaluation, but I also know that it's not necessarily that straightforward. And so sometimes surveys need to be validated. Do you have any tips about how to go about that process?
Yes, great question. Yes, first off, there are a ton of resources online, which I know is not the most helpful information because you could spend your entire career researching how to do surveys in the best way possible. But there are good resources out there for building good surveys. A couple things that you would want to think about is the question wording. I mean, maybe obviously, maybe not leading your participants into saying a certain thing. Ensuring the questions aren't double-barreled, meaning they're asking about two concepts instead of just one. So an example of that might be, maybe it's a scale question, and the question reads, I enjoyed this program for the speakers and the activities, and then your level of agreement. Well, you're actually asking them to evaluate two separate things there, the speakers and the activities. So there are little things that you can kind of look at to ensure that you're writing them in the clearest way possible and in a way that's as unbiased as possible or not leading. I would say for probably what you're doing, you don't need to worry too much about a validated survey, but it does depend on your end goal. So if your goal is for program improvement and to kind of demonstrate some of these impacts to stakeholders or funders, you probably don't need it. If your end goal is to publish the work that you're doing, you probably want to think a little bit more critically about that. So it's a little bit of a spectrum, and that's kind of the basic advice that I would give. But definitely take a look at survey building resources. SurveyMonkey has a really great guide, for example, of how to think through some of these things like double-barreled questions, non-leading questions, etc.
Good question. Any other ones?
I'm going to jump in quick. So this is kind of a niche question, and since we're on the topic of surveys, specifically when it comes to those satisfaction surveys that you were talking about earlier, majority of responses that I see a lot are people who either love the work that you're doing or absolutely hate the work that you're doing. Do you have any tips of how to reach those in the middle ground?
So that's just response rates entirely, like folks that are in the middle won't respond. You can always incentivize. So you could say, if you do this survey, we'll enter you into a drawing for a gift card or something like that. That's a good way to up participation. But maybe it's okay if it's kind of polarized like that. Depending on your needs, that could be okay. Because if you're looking at program improvement, what do I need to fix or work on moving forward to the next iteration of this program? The folks that are kind of those dissenters, disagreeers, kind of the negative end of the scale, they would give you really good insights as to what's not working, at least from their perspective, right? That's actionable stuff. Oh, I really hated this part of the program, or, oh, so-and-so wasn't responsive. Those are things you can act on. So that's actually really useful information. And the folks that are on the really positive side, the promoters, that's where you can get good insights as to what's working really well. You might get some wonderful quotes that you can use for promotion. You might better understand what elements of the program are really hitting with a lot of people and maybe how to double down on those things. So I would say, kind of depending on your needs, that might be okay. And then if it's not, then you can look into incentivizing. You can look into sending out the survey multiple times, following up with people, using some of those techniques.
Thank you.
Sure.
Trying to get that minimal response rate, right? 30% or higher. Hard part. Yeah, I think, let's see, any other?
I have a quick question.
Hey, Madhuri, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really helpful. I mean, this might hit a little bit on, experimental design and stuff like that. I was wondering about how you can, about attributing causation, especially if you're looking for things like learning gains or some of those psychosocial gains. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, how you might, different ways you might go about that and doing so robustly.
Yeah, that is an eternal question in this space. I think some of it is really intentional instrument and evaluation plan design. So with the correlation versus causation, if we're looking at long-term impacts, and let's say for a fictional program, I'm looking 5 years after people participated, and maybe it was a week-long summer camp, and 5 years later, how did this impact you? Okay, well, a week long is actually not that much time, right? So one thing that we think about is the length of time of the program, how much we might think that would kind of affect people, the length of time in between the program and when you're evaluating or asking them for responses. There's a lot of kind of different factors. I think if you're going the route of really wanting to show the causation, you do want to work with more validated measures. You do want to involve more experimental design, maybe even work with some researchers who can make sure that this is the highest level of quality. But then beyond that, with the evaluation, or excuse me, with the causation and correlation, it's really using common sense and kind of putting a lot of thought into the instrument design, the questions you're asking, and what's reasonable and what's not. We typically, in the space that I'm in, use a lot of self-report measures. So we might ask participants after completing, let's say, a year-long course to think about their skill levels at the beginning of the course versus now, and if there's any growth there. So sometimes self-report can be helpful because you're understanding from the participants' own experience what their involvement has looked like and what their gains have looked like. But it's a tricky line to walk, and it's kind of an internal question that needs to be taken in a case-by-case type basis, unfortunately.
That's a really good point there about time of engagement. So if you have a week long, one day, right, versus 1 year, correlation, causation, it probably changes the time. That's a really great question. Madhvi, did you want to follow up?
I would just say the level of impact too. So if this is a summer camp where they're there 10 hours a day, that's very different from a 1-day field trip program. So thinking about some of these factors that might influence that is really important when you're doing the instrument design and the evaluation plan design up front.
Yeah, and some grants have a preference. Some grantors, I mean, they'll say, we're trying to go away from these onesies, should we say, to more longer term, longish term exposures, right? That can have more likely to have an impact or a change in behavior. But I think it just depends, right? It depends on what you've done. We have lost grants because of that mode, onesie kind of thing. So now there's a transition into, okay, what else can we do that is more instructive in that space? And from your end, what are you seeing in terms of the field? Where are we going?
So I would say within the space that I work, which is largely informal STEM learning programs and youth programs in evaluation, there's definitely a bit of a shift towards these long-term outcomes. So similarly to how multiple engagements is preferred over single engagement, longer term outcomes are a little bit harder to measure, and therefore they're more in need. So rather than doing an evaluation or a study right after a program's completed, we actually might look several years down the line and try to suss out how that experience impacted the participants. I would say also cultural competency and cultural relevancy is huge right now, making sure that what we're doing is equitable, making sure that we're being extremely intentional with, our instrument design, with the plan design, with who we're involving, also with how we're communicating the results back to our populations. So something that traditionally we've seen is evaluation has kind of existed for almost, it's a little cheesy, but like the academic elite, the decision makers, these stakeholders at high levels in institutions, but the actual folks that participate in the evaluation or in the program or course, they don't get to see the results of the study. So they do these surveys or they do these interviews with you, and then it goes poof into higher level decision land, but they don't actually get to see what's been going on. So there's a little bit more focus on accountability and reporting back to the actual participants themselves. I would say, collaboration. This is huge in informal science and informal STEM learning right now, is collaboration between informal learning institutions, formal learning institutions, industry. And so when you think about that kind of shifts how you might approach evaluation as a whole. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I see it kind of moving, but there are so many different things that you can explore.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the granting agencies, at least that's one place, right, where they're putting out these RFPs, these requests for proposals, and you get the insight into what they're thinking about, right? What are some things? Do we want multiple engagements, right? Or these single things? If it's a single thing, then here are our expectations, right? In terms of what should happen or what change should be taking place. So that's fascinating. And to your point about once the survey is done, and then the participant really never get to see, poof.
Yeah.
I've been guilty of that, absolutely. So, and so that's a good insight for sure for others. Other questions?
I would say, or my question comes from branching off of the whole idea of communicating the results back to the different stakeholder groups. What specifically do you recommend that we should do when it comes to this? Because I'm guilty of this as well, as I send it up to the academic authorities and say, look what I did. And I completely forgot and dropped the ball about the audience of the people that I'm actually hoping to better. So is there something that we should, like, what do you recommend are some good communication strategies for reaching those people?
Yeah. I think it really depends on the audience. So if you're working with like kindergarten level kids, it's going to look really different from if you're looking at, STEM professionals, right? I would say an easy way to go about doing this is creating some sort of supplemental document along with your summative report, maybe like a one-page data brief or a one-page summary, and emailing that out saying, thank you so much for participating. Here's the results of our evaluation. Here's what we found. It's working really well, what we need to work on. You could also loop it into an annual report and make sure that the folks that are participating in your program or in your course are receiving that annual report as well. You can also, kind of depending on the audience, do something in person, verbally, post-pandemic, where maybe there's an end of the year celebration event. And if you are able to collect most of the data before then, maybe you come into this celebration event and as a part of the thank you speech, you go through some of the findings so that they can kind of figure out, oh yeah, I do remember participating in that focus group, and oh cool, that's what it went towards, and this is how it's going to then change the program moving forward for the next cohort.
It's a great question. Many avenues you can
Yes,
think about
get
from
creative.
the beginning. And I think also starting from the beginning, like asking yourself, okay, this is the plan that I seek to create, that at the end, I will share it in this way with people. It keeps you accountable too, right, to yourself.
Yep.
About that. That's definitely on my to-do list now, and some programs. Okay, last couple of questions, anybody, before we adjourn?
I had another question more about kind of how you got your current position. I'd love to hear more about kind of your formal training and evaluation.
Sure.
Basically, how
Yes.
maybe you can get those skills.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I came about evaluation while I was working in informal learning institutions. And like I said a little bit before, it was at a time when evaluation was really emerging as a field. And so we, at that time at our institution, did not have any in-house evaluation staff. So when we were doing our grant reporting or trying to assess our programs for best practices, there really wasn't anyone who was already credited with doing that work. So because it was an interest of mine, I kind of became that person. I did a lot of kind of on-the-job training with that. There are so many good resources online on AEA, which I'm a member of. There's all sorts of, webinars. There's at the annual conference, there's multi-day trainings and workshops and all sorts of good stuff. But a lot of it is practice-based. So just iterative, doing the work, learning and picking up skills over time. When we talked a little bit about survey design, for example, I had to learn that on the job. And so did a lot of my own research, pulled together resources for best practices, and actually several years later ended up leading a training in my next institution on best practices in survey design from that information. So my route, I want to say it's atypical, but honestly for evaluators, everyone's route is atypical. There's no really typical route to get to where I am today. And I've been doing this for several years, first in-house as an evaluator, then consulting while doing STEM equity work at the higher education level, doing this on the side, and then transitioning into doing this full-time in this last year, actually.
And the question that Rosario wanted to follow up was the AEA itself has a lot of resources. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I think survey design is definitely a big need. Definitely a session that we probably need to do soon.
Well, I've got some resources for you.
Food for thought, food for thought.
Yeah. I'll also say, if anyone is in kind of the cultural institution space, the Visitor Studies Association is another really great resource. There's also a couple podcasts I want to point you towards. One is called Evaluland, and then the other one is called The Ethical Rainmaker. And Evaluland is a little bit more focused on research and evaluation, best practices within the evaluation space itself. And the Ethical Rainmaker is a little bit more focused on equity within funding agencies and the nonprofit sector as a whole.
Thank you, Claire. The link is in the chat there. But these are great resources. My brain is like just absorbing everything.
Michael, Google on the side has all of the little, all of the stuff that you're talking about. I'm super excited to go back and look through all of these great resources.
Yeah, exactly. So with that, we're sort of towards the end here, and this actually, no, this is really the beginning. It's not really the end. This is the beginning. This is an ongoing conversation that we plan to have, talking about evaluation. Throughout the year, we're going to have different topics that we'll be talking about, or different groups that we're attending, and we can be asking them the same question. So, what is your impact? How are you assessing it? I think it always goes down to that same thing. And so it's always fun. So we encourage you to join us again. Most first Saturdays of each month, we're here and having fun conversations. Next month, we are going to be having a really great, actually it's a high school student that has a great STEM program that he just launched recently. He was featured on CNN. I won't spoil the surprise, but tune in next month for that. And our own Claire in March will be talking about some of her work that she's doing with communication and what she's looking at there. And so with that, thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. If there are no other last comments here, have a great Saturday, and we will be connecting very soon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
All
Sarah.
right. Thanks. All right, I'll stick around for